Hey, everybody, this is Dr. Sean Stickney. I'm one of the science tutors here at Purdue Global, and I have the pleasure of moderating tonight's discussion called Unveiling the Mind. And this is the psychological themes prevalent in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And specifically, we are focusing on the first installment of that trilogy called The Fellowship of the Rings. I'm joined tonight by two guest experts. I have Dr. Rabab Master and I have Mr. Kenny Rodriguez, and they are each going to contribute their expertise to the development of this presentation. So just a quick information about myself. As I said, I'm Dr. Sean Stickney. I am a behavioral epidemiologist. I actually profess at Georgia State University, and I actually did my doctoral degree from Purdue there in West Lafayette. So we have Dr. Rabab Master as one of our first guest experts. She has a PhD as well, and she specializes in motor control and neuroplasticity. And we have Mr. Kenny Rodriguez, who has a master's in psychology, and he specializes in perception and psychopathology, specifically ADHD. So what I'm going to do is let these two introduce themselves, talk a little bit more about their specializations within their field and their reasons for wanting to contribute to this project. Go ahead, Dr. Master.
Sure. Thanks for the introduction. So I was really interested in doing this webinar because whenever I watch anything, I'm always analyzing it anyway and thinking about how what's going on might be affecting the characters' brains and what could be happening under the hood, behind the scenes, in the mind. So it was a natural fit, and I love fantasy, science fiction, those type of shows. So big fan of Lord of the Rings. And yeah, I'm excited to get into it with all of you.
And if you could just real quick, Rabab, tell us a little about your specializations, what part of motor control and neuroplasticity is of interest to you?
Oh, yeah. So I'm interested in the hand. So I focused on human hand function, specifically like there's some type of injury to the brain, like stroke or cerebral palsy in kids. I looked at hemiparesis. So individuals who had half of their body might be working and then half might be having some difficulties. And looking at how the brain can be plastic. So the part that might be a bit damaged can recover and heal with certain types of training and behavioral interventions. So that was my main specialty.
Great. Okay, Kenny, if you could do the same for us and for the students assembled.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Kenneth Rodriguez. I hold a Bachelor of Science in Psychology and Computer Science, as well as a Master of Science in Psychology, like Dr. Stickney was saying before. I'm interested in understanding how humans and computers think, as well as those processes, how they cross between fields like machine learning and cognitive psychology. I'm also very interested in how people perceive and respond to various psychological challenges or disorders. And I like to analyze these issues through peer-reviewed research. I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan, and I've seen all three of the movies multiple times.
Okay, great. So those are our guest experts for tonight. And what I want to do is I want to just take you guys on a little trip through the two overarching themes that we're going to be discussing tonight. So Kenny will be talking about the psychological aspects of Frodo's burden, and he is going to provide some insight on the psychological struggle that Frodo went through. And then we're going to reflect some of the real world experiences that might be associated with that. And then our second theme is going to be the psychological identity and transformation. And within that segment, Dr. Master is going to talk about a couple different perspectives of how we self-identify and how our sense of self is transformed, namely the humanist perspective and the existentialist perspective. So that is the overall goal of this presentation. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right on in there. If you have questions, thoughts, or concerns about any of this, feel free to type this into the chat box, and we will go ahead and address your questions and comment on your thoughts as we develop our project here. So what we're going to look at is we are going to look at the Frodo's psychological burden is going to be the first thing that we're going to look at. So we have basically two overarching themes, and the one theme is the psychological burden that Frodo faced throughout the movie, The Fellowship of the Ring. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a couple different things, and our experts are going to kind of weigh in on their takes of these two themes. So we have Frodo's psychological burden, And then the second overarching thing that we're going to discuss is kind of the psychology of identity and transformation, right? So identity is how we see ourselves, how do we perceive ourselves? A lot of people call this our self-concept, right? So it's just the different aspects of ourselves as we show to the objective world. And then transformation is how these concepts are malleable and change over time. So as we begin this presentation, we're just going to go ahead and start out with the psychological burden that Frodo faced as he went through the evolution of struggling with the ring, right? So we're going to go ahead and have Kenny talk about this first part here. But as you may have heard other people say, if you have a thought or a perception or a question for us, feel free to go ahead and type that into the chat box, and we'll go ahead and monitor that and address that question. We want this to be interactive. Like I said, we want this to be more of like an infotainment type of thing, where we're kind of learning about something and we're learning about some of the psychological concepts, right? We're nerding out about it, but we're also kind of being entertained. So Kenny, if you could just go ahead and take it from here in terms of the psychological burden, specifically post-traumatic stress disorder, and then kind of associating that with some real world experiences that we might face that are similar to what Frodo faced.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Sean. So the question is, how does Frodo's psychological struggle with the One Ring reflect real world experiences of carrying overwhelming responsibilities or facing temptation? What coping mechanisms does he display? Specifically in the first movie, Frodo deals with a lot of trauma, including the threatened loss of the ring multiple times. He's chased and stalked and in fear of his life and the lives of his companions as well. He's also stabbed and poisoned physically and spiritually on Weathertop. There's also the attack at the ford, along with the mountain storm that he passes with the other hobbits and Gandalf and the other party members, which is, you can see kind of in that one video in the bottom right.
Okay, Kenny, if I can interrupt you real quick. Some people maybe aren't familiar with some of the nomenclature from the movie. They just can identify with the scene. So attack at the ford, can you just describe that real quick for people who maybe can't connect with the word ford?
Sure. Let me just look up what that was specifically.
I don't remember myself that particular word.
It's the journey when Frodo and the companions are pursued by the Nazgul at the fort of Bruinen. I might be pronouncing that wrong. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, I believe that's how you pronounce it. Absolutely.
It's a shallow crossing point on the river. It's a natural boundary of Rivendell where the elves live.
Okay, yeah. So as the audience listens to this, feel free to type into the chat room. And if you're not understanding some of the nomenclature of this, because you're more visually oriented into the movie, just please let us know. Okay, go ahead, Kenny. I'm sorry.
The storm on the mountain, that's the scene where I believe it's Saruman or the other wizard. I can't remember his name, but he creates that snow fall on top of all of them. And it creates a huge traumatic moment for the group altogether. The Watcher at the Moria doors, the Moria passage, and then the orc and troll attack where Frodo is struck with loss of consciousness. And in these situations, Frodo shows different coping mechanisms, including problem solving, where he thinks about the situation and creates a plan, social coping, where he relies on his team members to pick him up or to motivate him in bad times, emotionally focused, where he tries to rephrase situations throughout the first movie and think about them and how he could motivate himself or push forward more. And then meaning focused is where you develop some type of cognitive strategy to adapt to the situation, specifically a traumatic situation.
So I'm kind of wondering, as we all sit here and listen to this, and everybody can kind of see the bullet points here, are there any associations that we can make with Hollywood and the scenes that they exhibit and they describe and manifest in the movie with kind of what we go through in the real world, right? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, anytime you see a movie where someone goes through a situation that is extremely traumatic, whether it's violence, someone being involved in a shooting, or not just wartime events, this is any traumatic event, it can induce post-traumatic stress disorder, especially if the traumatic event is reoccurring on a regular basis, which Frodo does have in the movie, in the first movie.
You're suggesting he does have the PTSD or post-traumatic stress
Yeah,
disorder?
absolutely. He goes through a continued experience of being stalked, hurt, and threatened, which is, we'll go into the next slide in a bit, but that explains more of the DSM criteria.
Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and bounce this back to the audience just real quick. Does anybody have any
Sure.
thoughts or comments about some of the information presented on this first slide here from your own perspective? I know for myself, when I was watching this movie, I'm all about the self-concept, right? And I'm all about how we define certain priorities to different things in our lives and how that becomes part of how we express ourselves to the outside world. So for me, watching Frodo go through a psychological process of possession by the ring, it was interesting to watch his self-concept transform itself. And we'll talk about this later along the arch of the storyline. And so, I kind of thought that was interesting how, this negative aspect of self-perception was interwoven into the movie as it advanced, right? So I think that's my take. Rabab, do you want to say anything about this particular slide before we advance?
Yeah, I think like from a neuroscience or behavioral neuroscience perspective, when I was thinking about like how he changed himself, like every time he was attacked, he seemed more and more jumpy. Like the first time he was relatively rattled, but then the second time he was even more, like with each subsequent event that's listed, he just got more and more irritable or jumpy or frightened. And it's like it compounded upon itself. So that was showing the stress of on his brain of all those events, knocking down all the normal like inhibitory activity that would be there that would calm him down. But because he had to be on high alert for such a long period of time and so many things happened, his system became like hyperactive and he was so red alert that you could tell at the beginning he seemed like a really chill, cool guy. And then as it went on, he became like more and more uptight and tense and, like getting angry and like barely the same person that he was at the very beginning when we saw him with Gandalf. And he was like almost like a little kid, like, I'm so happy to see you. You're back in town and let's have a party. And then look at him now, like he's just very high
Right.
strung.
And I think from my perspective, and again, the audience, I'd like you guys to kind of weigh in on this if you feel so led. From kind of a neuroscientific perspective, I kind of wondered as I watched the movie, were his brain cells, his neurons, was the circuitry being rewritten? Were his neurons establishing new connections and his template for his sense of self was changing throughout the movie? Or was it simply a product of stress and like cortisol release, right? Was he having kind of a physiologic response to neurotransmitters and hormones? Or was his brain being rewired, which was manifest in his personality change, right? So I think as I look at it, I think of it that way.
I just wanted to add in before Rabab said something that it felt, especially for me with Frodo, that he was in control in the beginning. His executor, in psychopathology, they talk about executor, mind, brain, body. It's a tier. And it felt like Frodo's executor was gone and that the amygdala was basically running the show, his fight or flight response.
Yeah, that's a great point. All right, we can go ahead and advance the slide unless there's any questions from the audience or any thoughts or perceptions.
I think Melissa had a question.
Go ahead.
The question was, why does Frodo have the feeling of loss for the ring, but Aragorn does not? Why is Aragorn able to fight that feeling more? And she wrote, and Legolas didn't either. We did briefly go over this at one point, but Aragorn was educated on the corruption of the ring. And like someone else said, he had strong will and wisdom. Having that knowledge about the effects of what the ring can do to oneself, I think that was able to help Aragorn a lot throughout the movie and resist that corruption of the ring. Whereas someone like Frodo might not had that education or was raised with that awareness of the ring. And I think that that really affected him. And same with Legolas. I believe that he was raised with the knowledge of the ring. And this goes to show that when you have education or knowledge, you really can progress past something that might be very inhibited for other people or might stop other people.
So, Rabab, what about this? Maybe you can speak to this. So that's one plausible explanation that Kenny was talking about, and it seems very commonsensical. But what about the fact that humans and hobbits and elves have different neurobiologies. And so maybe their brains are just kind of built a little different way. Do you think that might be something that affected him as well?
Yeah, I think actually like Frodo was kind of affected by the ring, but not as much as others. So I think what we got to see in the movie, which was pretty cool, was like the ring goes to a lot of different people or it goes near a lot of different characters and they all have like different degrees of attraction to it or they get changed by it to some different degree. So yeah, Frodo was definitely more affected than Aragorn, but I think there were other characters that were even way more affected than Frodo too. So it was kind of shown to be a spectrum of like how vulnerable someone was to being manipulated by the ring or like put under some kind of influence of the ring. And I think it's kind of similar to like when you have different type of drugs, like some people, if they take it, they might have more of an effect if they're exposed to it, and others might have less of an effect. And that could just be like genetics and biology, like just, by the random chance, some people are just at their circuitry is more responsive to one substance or another.
Right, or different parts of their brain, maybe their limbic system are more or less developed. So, this is pretty good stuff. We'll go ahead if we're ready and we'll advance the slide. Is everybody cool with that?
Alexander had a question for you.
Go ahead.
Do you think Frodo's slipping on the ring is a psychological meaning of disassociating from his current reality, like an out-of-body feeling from PTSD?
I think it could be. I think that it could have been a coping mechanism as well to show him a different side of life that he could have, which is not great because it's the corruption of the ring. But I do think that it could be in part to disassociate, to escape reality. Because by the end of the first movie, or at least throughout the first movie, Frodo is dealt a lot of heavy trauma and he is going to be looking for some way to escape. So I do think that could be somewhat of a plausible explanation.
Yeah, that's a great, great question. All right, let's go ahead and flip this forward and talk a little bit more about that.
So we're just going to go over Frodo's burden again in Lord of the Rings, the first one. And we're going to be specifically looking at it within the DSM-5. The DSM-5 is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that's used in psychology, mental health, and a lot of other, it can be used in sometimes nursing or psychiatry as well. The first bullet point is Frodo's traumatic stress disorder is characterized by his internal will to cope with his war experiences throughout space and time. When the Nazgul approach, Frodo's wound pain returns. So that is a great visualization of how when a pain or some type of thought reoccurs, Frodo is then thrown back into that state of anxiety, fear, and worry and stress. And then just really quick, part A of the DSM's PTSD, the criteria. The outline is significant trauma. One of the first requirements is being exposed to actual or threatened death or severe harm in one or more of the following: directly experiencing painful events, which Frodo does, and then observing events in person as it was experienced by others, and which he does. So he does meet some of the beginning criteria for PTSD within the DSM-5.
Okay, so if we kind of unpack that a little bit,
Sure.
right, when we look at this from a PTSD point of view, and I'm kind of cueing into the first bullet point there, where, we have this internal battle, this coping battle, in just putting this into a real world context of less psychological jargon and then just something that we can kind of connect with just more personally in our lives. Can we kind of make an association there, Kenny, at all?
Yeah, we could. If, let's say, someone had a traumatic event in real life and they returned to that environment or an environment that reminded them of that trauma, it can provoke some of those feelings, provoke the amygdala, and increase the stress for that individual. And I feel you can see that within the movie as well when Frodo, the wound returns. It's like he's going back through the trauma again and is in that fight or flight mode.
Okay, that's a really good point. Rabab, do you have anything to add to that at all when you look at the slide?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that he feels the pain again. So it's is kind of like the flashback. I think that we would talk about like reliving. So sometimes I guess we've heard a common example where the fireworks can often give a flashback of a wartime memory because they sound like bombs. And I think that it's a similar concept where he has this pain and it's the wound and it's like, yeah, your brain. So he sees the riders and it reminds him of that first event where he was stabbed. So he feels the pain again. So even if the rider has not stabbed him the second time or the third time or the fourth time, but that stab comes back every time, the feeling of being stabbed, because his brain is reactivating completely. Like neuroscience perspective, it's like all it needs is the first trigger, like the sound or the sight, and all the rest of the feelings, the pain, they come back. They're all like linked together like that. So if one comes, it brings everything else, and then you fall into the flashback, and that's one of the main symptoms of the PTSD.
That's a really good point.
It was
Do
a
we have any
great,
questions?
great
Go ahead.
explanation, Rabab.
Thanks.
Any audience members have any thoughts or any kind of questions for us as we move past this slide?
J.R.R. asks, should we not return to a bad place that gives us trauma also?
Yeah, I can just explain. I think possibly in the beginning, when that trauma is so present and one maybe hasn't gotten therapy for it or some type of therapy to help them process the feelings and emotions, I think at a later point, something like exposure therapy, where the individual slowly increases their actions within that environment. I think that would be helpful, but I don't know if right in the beginning, returning to a traumatic environment would be the best decision.
Yeah, I 100% agree. That's exactly what I was going to say. With exposure therapy, that is one thing where, like, you want to take baby steps always with the professional, just very tiny amounts when you're ready, when you've done like the talking and the emotional work through it and you feel ready, then tiny, tiny amounts, So an example would be like if your traumatic event was maybe, let's say, in a classroom and then you had trouble going to the classroom, then maybe you would start by like getting a binder or maybe a fluorescent light, like, I don't know, like very gradually tiny bits and pieces of things and see how you react. So if you react like really badly right away, then you're not ready. But like if it's a small thing and you are able to manage it, then wait a while and try a little bit more. So yeah, not to jump in all at once, exactly like you said.
I'm going to go ahead before we switch and just float this up the flagpole and see if it waves. So as I think about psychopathology, right, and I think about PTSD and its obvious relevance within the arch of the movie, I'm wondering about clinical depression, because as I look at clinical depression and I look at the diagnostic criteria, plus knowing people in my personal life who have the clinical depression, one of the hallmark symptoms is that they don't feel up or down, good or bad, right or wrong, positive or negative about a particular situation or instance. And so as the movie unfolds, and especially the trilogy, right, I see, from my perspective, I see Frodo start to unplug from his emotions. And so I'm looking at, would clinical depression, right before he gets to Mount Mordor or Mordor and Mount Doom, before he gets there, we kind of see him feeling numb to the world, right? And he seems to lose his hobbitness. He seems to lose this effervescence and this joy. And so my mind goes with this idea is clinical depression maybe part of the picture that he starts to manifest over time? Do we want to talk about that a little bit? Do you guys agree? Do you disagree? Am I out there in left field somewhere?
I think, yes, it can, because a lot of the times post-traumatic stress, well, all post-traumatic stress disorder is in the past. And when we get stuck in the past, you can easily become more depressed. Just like if you get stuck in the future, you can become more anxious. And I think when Frodo gets stuck with depression, like you were talking about, or could that be a possibility? 100% it could be a possibility. And I think his friends definitely have a lot to do with that, with bringing him back to the present or trying to bring him back to the present. Because in something like cognitive behavioral therapy, we want the individual to be practicing and be aware of the present so that they're not stuck in the past or the future.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing. Okay, unless there's any other questions, we'll go ahead and flip this forward. So what we're doing now is we're going to the second theme of our discussion here. And that's just this theme of identity and transformation within the movie. So we got a couple different perspectives that Rabab is going to talk about, and she's going to begin with something called the humanist perspective. So Rabab, just real quick, if you could just define that and take that down to people who maybe don't specialize in this, how would we define that?
Absolutely, I could do that. So, for the humanist perspective of identity, it's the idea that we all of us that are humans have a potential, like a great potential to progress our identity to greater and greater levels of growth. And through that growth, we might experience and explore love and fulfillment and self-esteem. But the only thing really blocking us from doing that could be like our basic needs not being met. So like if you are looking for food and shelter and even oxygen, fresh air, stuff like that, basic needs, then you can't focus on growing to your true potential as a human and being like such a loving person because you're just like grabbing at essentials. So that's, I think, one way of looking at the basic humanist perspective. And when I saw the Hobbit town and like the way they lived, it looked like a very loving place, right? So I think in a way he kind of starts off in a really lovely place where he has a lot of love and he has all his basic needs, like they're always eating and it's very green and fresh. The air is always clear. And so he's at this level of love and belongingness, like they are fulfilled to a great level of potential, but in a way, they're also not really pushed to the next levels where they might want to prove their self-esteem and their self-worth and even look for a sense of fulfillment in healing something that's wrong because there's nothing really going wrong that they would feel driven to fix in the Hobbit world, right? It's very idyllic. So I think one of the things is that starts him to think that he has to fix something and maybe think about a life outside of just love and friendship and having, parties and stuff like that is when Gandalf tells him in the movie. It was like a very dramatic scene. I don't know if you guys remember this moment, but it was very powerful where Gandalf was kind of explaining to him about the One Ring, and he was, as you mentioned before too, like he didn't know anything about it. It's not like he was raised with it like Aragorn or Legolas. It was just there, and it's just very new to him. And then he's explaining, like, Gandalf, I can't take it. Like, I am too powerful. And if it controlled me, it would control all my power and it could wreak a lot of havoc through me. And then Frodo is like, comes to the realization because Gandalf doesn't say, like, you have to take it. He just says, I can't take it. So then Frodo, I think that's like a humanist perspective, right? In this moment, his identity starts to shift, right? Like he's growing into a next potential. So he sees like, this Shire, like if it stays here, my home, the ring will bring all these bad forces here looking for it. So I have to get it out of here. I have to protect my home. So now he has like a higher purpose or calling. And it's like his own self-esteem. He's like, I can do this, I can save my town. So then he's just like, what do I do? Like, tell me, what must I do? So yeah, I thought that was a really nice transformation moment. Does anyone have any thoughts about that? I see Melissa says the stress of the burden of the ring and destroying the ring weighs on him. Yeah, like that's probably the most stressful thing he's encountered to that point in his life, I think. It's just a huge change for him and like how everything was and then how it started to turn.
I think I'd like to just go ahead and add just a couple seconds of my own take on this. So one of the things I'm looking at in terms of identity and transformation is I'm looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So most of us in here understand kind of the 5 levels of the hierarchy of needs, where we start with physiologic needs, and then we go to safety and love and belonging and esteem and self-actualization. So if I look at transformation, what I look at is our sense of self moving through these different phases and moving up. And so when I hear Dr. Master talk about this idyllic agrarian society of Hobbiton, how they're so blissfully ignorant of the outside world and they kind of have these social roles that they fit into. I'm wondering if that's kind of a phase of self-actualization, right? Where they've achieved kind of their full Hobbit potential. But then once Gandalf gives Frodo the ring and sets him out on the journey, I wonder if he starts moving back down the hierarchy of needs as he continues to bring the ring to Mount Doom, right? So if you kind of follow the arc of the movie, they start obviously dealing with safety needs and love and belonging and missing the Shire. And then they start dealing with some physiology needs of, when they were given the lambda spread and how that was starting to kind of wear off and stuff. So and I just look at this hierarchy of needs and I watch him kind of go backwards, right? And then he goes down the hierarchy of needs. And so I wonder if anybody else have any thoughts about that. Robob, do you have any thoughts about that at all?
I agree with you, Dr. Stickney. I was thinking very similar.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think like after this point, then yeah, he does have so much struggle where like he never knew what it was like to go hungry or to fear for his safety. And then now, yeah, he's gone in reverse. And I think it's interesting because when you learn about the hierarchy of needs, it's always like a linear pyramid that, like, okay, first you need to make sure you have food and you're an infant and that's all you think about, and then safety. But like in real life, sometimes you might be at one higher level, and then he was initially going for esteem and like fulfillment, like to play a great role, and like he was going higher, but then through that journey he lost all the stuff he had before, his food source, his safety source, and that's why a lot of the time it was so hard for him to continue on, and it was like he wanted to give up, and so many times, right, Sam saved him, carried him, did everything. So yeah, it was pretty cool that we got to see it go both ways. And then I think eventually at the end, when you come out of it on the other end, then you see that, okay, so I had all of this and then I went through all of that. And then now I've come out even stronger and like with a better idea of what might fulfill me. But it's not a linear journey. It's very like back and forth.
And so that's a good point for everybody out there, right? Is just, she's right. I mean, when you look at the hierarchy of needs, we look at it linearly, we look at it kind of non-dimensionally, right? So just in terms of one of the takeaway messages of identity and transformation is just look at kind of the dynamism, right? Of how we can ebb and flow and go back and forth among all the different needs. So unless there's any questions, we can go ahead and press on, right? Are we good there?
I do see a couple of questions from Melissa. She says, can the creation of the fellowship be a humanist perspective? And I do think like that fellowship was all the different groups that lived in Middle Earth that all said like we have to think ahead more than just our own community even, and just think about Middle Earth as a whole and protecting it. So that was very humanist, that they wanted to move up and like think about like not just their own little communities and having love and belonging, but actually like protecting and doing something meaningful and fulfilling to protect the whole community. So yeah, the whole large Middle Earth itself. And I think not having your needs met, is that traumatic or just stressful? And then we have Kenneth replied, it can be both. Yeah. Yeah, it can definitely become traumatic if it's prolonged and intense, or even if you are just vulnerable. So maybe some people might be more resilient to it, as we discussed before. But yeah, even that is part of the trauma, right? With the bread, that was a pretty big plot point. And then at the end, I think, yeah, it was like all running out. It was tough for them.
All right, I'll go ahead and advance the slide.
So this was just another scene from the movie where I recall that actually Bilbo was carrying this burden for a long time and he passed it on to Frodo in a way. And like he's a lot older, right? And like he was almost like a father figure to Frodo. And I think that's often the case if you look at your own families or like other people around you, that the parent figure will carry a burden for a while, and then at a certain point it gets passed on to the next generation, and it's very universal, and it does result in advancing through the hierarchy. So now you're not just a kid partying, now you have burdens, and you are having self-esteem that comes with that I can carry these burdens and I can take care of people. So, and it's moving up, and then you think about fulfilling your wishes and your like greater purpose. And so yeah, that was another moment. And also I think Courtney has a comment that habits, yeah, they found a coping mechanism in their food. Yeah, the hobbits. when they were traveling. I thought that was really nice. It was very funny also because like literally every time they stopped and then I think it was Mary and Pippin, often maybe Sam, I feel like they just start cooking and then the fire would attract like every single bad guy. And then so they'd be like, are the hobbits cooking again? And it's like, stop, put out the fire. I thought that was hilarious. But they needed it, right? Like they really needed that food to help comfort them because it was so difficult to deal with. Yeah, Sam and his potatoes. Every time, every time. I was like, just don't start the fire. You're going to attract all the attention. Yeah, that was very funny.
So we can think about that from our perspective, right? I mean, a lot of us will use food as a crutch for depression or anxiety, and either we consume more or we consume less of it. So there's certainly an association there. Yeah.
Absolutely. Stress eating is something we can relate to those hobbits.
Was there
Oh,
another
yeah.
comment?
Yes, Melissa says Mary and Pippin were missing not having their elevenses, which was, I think, their meal between breakfast and lunch. They had like a middle meal called elevenses. So they couldn't, they were like, how come we don't have this extra meal? I miss my elevens. Yeah, the food was a big part of it. And then I was just going to finish up. I think this goes back to where we talked about the role of the fellowship itself. So, like, basically, Frodo really stepped up again because first he was just taking the ring up to the fellowship. And then when he met all the other representatives, he actually said, you know what? I can still do this. I can do it all the way. And he said, I'll do it. And like, I thought that was like his esteem. Like, first he's like, I'm just a hobbit. I could never. And then he saw like how they were all fighting and he's like, actually, I could. I could do this, you know? So that was nice, like a growth for him, a humanist growth perspective. So in a way, it's a big burden, but it's also empowering that he's this leader now.
Okay, so before we kind of switch on to the next perspective, we just putting a bow on this. We talked about how our identities are defined and how our identities change over time as a consequence of stress or as a consequence of experience. And we kind of overlapped that with the hierarchy of needs and how the hierarchy of needs is dynamic, right? And it's not linear. And we can just go back and forth among the hierarchies. So we have something called an existentialist perspective now. And I think this is our concluding couple slides of our presentation. So, Rabab, if you can go ahead and put that into layman's terms for us.
Yeah, so in existentialist perspective, it's slightly different from humanist. So instead of thinking about fulfilling your potential to love and find fulfillment, it's about looking at meaning and purpose. So it's more about like what's meaningful to you, and that's who you are. And what's your purpose? That's who you are. And how does that change over your life? So it could change in many ways. So in a way, it's a lot less rigid and it's a lot more open-ended and individualized because we could all have a different source of meaning and that makes us who we are. So it's not that one is right and one is wrong. It's just like different ways of looking at who you are. So you could be like from a humanist perspective, maybe I am in my love and belonging stage, you know, with my family and my friends, or maybe from an existentialist perspective, I'm in my phase where I'm getting most of my meaning from my career. So it's just different ways of looking at who you are. So for existentialist perspective, I saw Frodo dancing at the party and having fun. And I thought his whole existence and his meaning in life is just like having a good time, really, right? Like that was his meaning. That's his purpose. And that's why it was kind of interesting. There was like this another scene at the very, very beginning of the very first movie where Frodo sees Gandalf and he says, what news of the outside world? Tell me everything. And Gandalf says, everything, but you're far too eager and curious for a hobbit. It's most unnatural. So I think that's indicative of like Gandalf has known the hobbits for so long because he's so old and generally like they do their meaning and purpose is, you know, like good food and good friendships and stuff like that. And they stay very isolated from anything else, anyone else, any other communities, any other topics. So it was very surprising that Frodo already had like this curiosity and this interest, and he wants to know what's going on outside. That showed another part that maybe there's some meaning and purpose already in there that he kind of wants to find meaning outside of the Shire, even from the very beginning of the movie, like a hint as to where he's going to go later. So does anyone have any questions before I move on or comments about? And I think about the existentialist perspective, it's one way of looking at it is you can also think about like yourself existing in isolation. So you focus mostly on yourself, or like you focus on a small bubble of people around you. So that's your existence, like you, your mom and your dad, or your spouse, your children, a couple people close to you. Or you could have a wider bubble and you think your existence encompasses also a bigger community, like a local community, or even larger, like now you're thinking about the environment and all the trees, and you feel very connected and aware of everything around you is still part of your own existence. So that's one way of looking at an existentialist perspective. And I saw that as Frodo went out, his circle of awareness grew bigger and bigger. So first he was like aware of the Shire, but as soon as they went out, there was this warning, like the enemy has lots of spies, be careful. And suddenly he's looking around and he's aware of existing in a place where there's spies and like there's a whole forest, and his bubble of existence suddenly grows bigger, you know? And I thought that was really interesting. The way in his mind he imagines the world, it just grew, and it became a bit scarier too as it grew. And I think that happens to us too when we go out and we see more of the world, and then we have more to be worried about too. And that's also Elrond, I think, echoing what Gandalf was saying before, like this is the hour of the Shire folk when they arise from their quiet fields to shake the towers and the councils of the great. So in general, like the hobbits, they never really left their Shire and they had a very tiny existence geographically. And now they have kind of expanded out. And when they did, going back to what Dr. Stickney was saying, that they were so strong in their basic needs, their food, their love, their belonging, that they had so much good and fulfilled existence that they could go and they could fight all these dark forces out there with their own internal strength of positive energy and elements. So that was pretty cool.
Oh, let me just add one more thing just from my take on this, because when I look at kind of an existentialist perspective, right, what I also go back to is self-concept theory. So I mentioned this originally, and we have this thing called a global self-concept, right? And I always teach it like our self-identity is like a pizza, and we have these different slices that make us who we are that comprise the pizza. And some slices are bigger than other slices. So in terms of a self-concept, a bigger slice is going to be more important to you and comprise more of you and your identity than a smaller piece of pizza, right? So when I start hearing Dr. Master talk about, how the hobbits define themselves and some of their intrinsic qualities, I start thinking about the global self-concept, whether it's their emotional self-concept or whether it's their psychosocial self-concept. So I kind of look at how they see themselves and what aspect of themselves is most important at the time. And then that's what they're going to fall back on to perceive the world, because they're going to look through the lens of their biggest piece of that pizza. So I kind of overlay that on top of it as well. If anybody wants to say, Kenny or Bob, if you think there might be some kind of association there before we move on.
I just think that for the hobbits, yeah, it was a huge emotional risk. And I don't know if that slice of the pizza was as big as some of their other areas, but I do think that eventually they got to the point where they were self-realized or self-actualized and were able to transform to a state where they can handle everything.
Right, we'll go ahead and flip this to the last slide.
Yeah, so then I looked at Sauron, because if I look from an existential perspective, he's very interesting because, like, from a perspective of being aware, he's even depicted as a big eye, right? And he's being described in many times, like different quotes, like Saruman would say, oh, he's concealed within his fortress. He sees, the Lord of Mordor still sees all. His gaze pierces cloud, shadow, earth, and flesh. And then Gandalf said, and into this ring he poured his cruelty, his malice, and his will to dominate all life, and he does not share power. So it's interesting because, again, it's not linear. Like, so you might think that, well, if you're aware of more and more and more, then you would care about more. But in this case, it's like Sauron is aware of such a wide bubble beyond himself. Like he has this great ability to pierce so many people and creatures and realms. He can see it, but he doesn't kind of like love it as he loves himself. He sees it like something to dominate, and he wants to have power over it. So even though he's aware of it, he's not kind of like caretaking it or interacting with it productively. So that's an interesting dichotomy about Sauron that I noticed.
Okay, so as we kind of put a bow on this presentation here, we got a couple minutes left. I'd like to have each of our experts just give a general impression of their topic and just general concluding remark, if possible, about some of these associations that we've been talking about. So Kenny, from your perspective, if you could boil everything down to say what are a couple of the main points that we want to extract from this, what would you say?
I think some of the main points is that PTSD is not only a wartime traumatic event. It can happen from anything from a car crash to a stabbing to, like Rabab said, something in a classroom that occurred. It does not have to be something during wartime. And we all have a certain resilience in life, but some of us are not as resilient, and this can really affect certain people. Also, another point I wanted to make is that the ring itself almost has a traumatic effect in that it gives you power or leaches power, but it also takes from you. And so that can be a very confusing area for people who might not be as resilient.
Okay, and then Dr. Master, if you could do the same kind of with your neck of the woods over there.
Yeah, so I think I just looked at identity and transformation. So it was how I really focused on Frodo and, like, to a smaller extent, the other hobbits and their identity, because I think it transformed the most over the course of the first movie. And it was like a lot to do with just leaving the bubble of the Shire, and also because they had this great burden and task, and they had to take responsibility and they had to save their town. So I looked at the two perspectives, humanistic, which was like we talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is a good example of one progression in that perspective, where maybe as your needs are met, you can advance further and grow further and go from love to self-esteem to fulfillment on a larger scale for a larger cause. And that's kind of how they started to go, although they have gone backwards in the middle as well. And existentialist take was that we're defined by what is meaningful to us and what we see as our purpose. And like what was meaningful in this case, you can look at it as an expanding bubble around the hobbits. So first it was just the Shire, and then they went out and out and out, and they had this bigger purpose as well. But then Sauron was an example where he had a lot of meaning and purpose in his life, I guess, and it's a lot of awareness, but it's kind of skewed by his obsession with power. So he's not looking to have a positive relationship with all of these levels that he's aware of.
Okay, I think that was well said by both of you. Did the audience members have any questions or thoughts for us before we go ahead and put a bow on this? So we're hoping that you guys got something out of this. Again, we're going to be doing a number of these different types of perspectives. So this first one was more about looking at the psychology of this trilogy and the movie specifically. And so, the three of us hope that you took and extracted some meaning from this and made some associations, maybe with the real world, or maybe within your own lives, and how your lives might mirror the chronology of the movie and vice versa. Unless you guys have any other questions, we want to thank you for coming and showing up and giving us some feedback and asking some questions. I'll go ahead and end the presentation unless there's any questions there, and we'll go ahead and conclude that. All three of us are science tutors, as well as Dr. Derby there. So as you go through your situations, and I'm talking more to the students right now, as you want to maybe talk about some curiosities that maybe you have or some connections to class content, then I would encourage you guys to just come on into the Science Center and just chill with us a little bit, right? And just kind of chat about some of the stuff. And if we can be of any help to you guys, just let us know. So unless there's any other questions, I'll go ahead and put a bow on this.
And we will be looking at the second and third movie and book as well, in the psychology concept and science overall. We're going to be doing the science a little differently. We'll also be looking at other ones like I Am Legend, Avatar, Hunger Games, Harry Potter. So there's going to be all different ones we're going to look at on top of Lord of the Rings.
Okay, great. I'll go ahead and close down the presentation unless there's anything else. And I want to thank everybody for attending and sticking with us.
Thank you, everyone.
Yep. Thanks so much. Have a good night, guys.
Thank you. Have a great night.